Have you ever bought something in a theme park and thought, there's gotta be a story behind that? Well, you're in the right place. We're Amanda, Kevin, and Kim, the team behind Where in the Park, and we've spent years exploring the parks, creating seek and find games that uncover the details that most people miss. And now we're diving into the history, stories, and secrets behind those magical details. So grab your curiosity and maybe even a churro, and let's explore the parks together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Where in the Park podcast. This is Kevin, and on this episode, we will once again be covering Where in the Knott's Berry Farm Park. In our previous episode about Knott's, we told the story of how Walter Knott moved his family to Buena Park, California, to try his hand at farming, and quickly became a prominent berry farmer. We also explained how Knott's Berry Place transformed into the California Marketplace shopping area found just outside the gates to the theme park today. We mentioned that in future episodes, we would be exploring Ghost Town and the other sections that were added to the park over the years, but that will have to wait. Because in this episode, we are continuing to keep our season passes in our pockets. This episode releases on July 4th, 2025, exactly 59 years after Walter Knott opened his own version of Independence Hall to the public in 1966, and that area is what this episode is all about. But before we start talking about Independence Hall, we want to remind you that here at Where in the Park, we make seek and find experiences for you to enjoy at theme parks. Visit our website, www.whereinthepark.com, to find both physical and digital game packs that come with a deck of cards that have images on them that are hidden somewhere in the theme park of your choice. The question is, where in the park can you find those images? Use code PODCAST10 to take 10% off your next purchase. We have a full-size game and a mini game for Knott's Berry Farm. If you think you enjoy the park now, you'll be amazed how it's even better while playing a Where in the Park game. Now, back to Independence Hall. We're going to be honest here. There are many people who visit Knott's Berry Farm and have no idea that this building exists on property. Like I said, it's not in the park. If you know where Knott's Soak City Water Park is located, this building is found across from its entrance. You can visit between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. any day of the week, and it's still free to the public per Walter Knott's wishes. If you aren't sure how to get to Knott's Soak City from the theme park, it's located on the other side of Beach Boulevard. You can get there by going through the tunnel near the Peanuts headquarters shop, which is lined up with the crosswalk near Virginia's gift shop. Just head toward the picnic area instead of the parking lot on the other side of the tunnel. Keep walking along the sidewalk there, and you will eventually find a brick building with white trim and a clock tower with a steeple on top. Coming from this direction, you're facing the same side of Independence Hall that you would see when coming from Chestnut Avenue in Philadelphia, which is actually where you need to enter from if you plan to take a tour at the real location. It looks like it's the back of the building, but it's technically considered the front, and it's where you will find the open door to explore at Knott's Berry Farm. Again, if you get there between 10 and 4. We do want to make it clear that Independence Hall at Knott's was an incredible feat. Several trips were taken to the original to inspect every section of the building, and countless books and research materials were referenced. Hundreds of color photos were taken, inside and outside, in a time when black and white photos were more common, due to how much more expensive color film and processing was at the time. Every design they came up with had to be approved by city officials in Buena Park to make sure they would be up to code, at least by 1966 standards. All of the ornate cabinetry inside the building, as well as furniture and chandeliers, were done by skilled craftsmen. They also had paint experts carefully mixing and blending hundreds of gallons of paint to try to match colors, in a time years before color computer matching would exist. On top of that, they did something not found in the original, devising a 14-track stereo tape to recreate debates in a declaration chamber presentation. When asked why he wanted to build Independence Hall, Walter Knott said, "It is not only the most historical building in America, but it is one of the most beautiful and stately structures. Our greatest documents, the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, were both worked out and signed there. Just as Ghost Town vividly reminds us of our gold rush beginnings in California, Independence Hall takes us back to the very founding of our country. Truly, this building is the birthplace of America and the greatest shrine to individual freedom in all the world." Like Mr. Knott said, the actual Independence Hall in Philadelphia is considered the birthplace of America. But how did we get that original building in the first place? We've said before that this isn't a history podcast because we are a podcast about exploring the details of theme parks. So even though we are going to do a bit of a deep dive into the story behind the real Independence Hall right now, keep in mind that we are sharing all of this to explain why it was built and who were involved in the designs of that original building, because it's also the history of this theme park edition. And the key events that took place there undoubtedly led to Walter Knott's decision to build his version of Independence Hall in Buena Park at his Knott's Berry Farm property. So let's have some fun walking the timeline. We'll start with the province of Pennsylvania being founded in 1681 by William Penn. The city of Philadelphia was then founded in 1682 as that colonial era province's capital, and a colonial government was established in 1683. That government did not have an official building to operate from. They instead met at a variety of places, depending on where you do your research, whether it was a private house, taverns, the Old City Hall, or the Friends Meeting House, which was essentially a Quaker version of a church. Um, that's where they met. They didn't have a spot to actually meet up. So, after roughly 50 years of this, the assembly and the citizens of Philadelphia grew tired of the members of the government taking over those buildings and petitioned to build a state house. In the spring of 1729, they had raised £2,000 for this purpose. A lawyer named Andrew Hamilton, who was also the Speaker of the Assembly, along with Councilman Thomas Lawrence and Assemblyman Dr. John Kersley, were appointed to a committee to select the site, make the plans for the building, and contract out the work for it to be built. After some debate on where to put the building, land started being purchased near the end of 1730. They had decided to build in an area that, at the time, was considered the outskirts of the city of Philadelphia. There's an article from the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography from 1916 that goes into great detail about the ownership of those lots of land, chronicling their transfers from William Penn through to the State House yard. And we'll provide a link to it if you want all of that information, as we won't be going over it here. The State House plans were drawn by Edmund Woolley, a master carpenter and the principal builder who arguably based the design on the original plans by Andrew Hamilton. I say arguably because apparently it's an age-old debate where for years Andrew Hamilton received all the credit for the design, but then a receipt from 1735 showed that Woolley was paid £5 for drawing drafts, fronts, aka elevations, and plans for the first and second floors of the State House. So it's not really known whether Woolley drew Hamilton's designs or if Hamilton just took credit for Woolley's designs, but people much more scholarly than me seem to lean more toward Woolley being the designer over Hamilton. I don't personally have a horse in this race, so you can choose whichever one of them you prefer. It's worth pointing out, though, that those original designs weren't like modern day blueprints. They were just rough sketches of what the building should look like, with Edmund Woolley being the principal builder deciding on the details after he started construction. And that construction finally began in 1732. And though the Pennsylvania Assembly first occupied the building in 1735, the assembly room wasn't finished until 1745, and the top floor wasn't completed until 1747. And some references say the building wasn't finished until 1748. A description of the building, as quoted from Edward M. Riley's Independence National Historic Park Guidebook from 1954, reads, "A most ambitious project for that early date. It emerged a sturdily constructed brick edifice described at the time as a large, handsome building, with a facade 107 feet in length, connected by closed arcades or piazzas to wing buildings some 50 feet long. The main building had a decked gable roof, balustraded between the chimneys and surmounted by a centrally located cupola. The first floor contained two chambers about 40 feet square, separated by a spacious center hall about 20 feet wide. The State House was not elegantly furnished. Chairs, tables, curtains, screens, and other items purchased for the building were never unduly expensive. The building appears to have been heated originally by open fireplaces, for which stoves were later substituted. There is no known pictures of the interior of the State House during the colonial period. The earliest representation is a painting of the assembly room attributed to Pine and Savage, the Congress voting independence, which was executed about 1800. There were some parts skipped in that book quote, but I read what I did because I realized I haven't spent much time describing what the building looks like. So at least you have some clue of what I'm even talking about if you are familiar with this building. But also, it's interesting how even for the time, it was considered nice, but modest. Now, I want to take a second to compare this description with what we have at Knott's Berry Farm. This description doesn't mention anything about a bell tower or clock, but it does mention closed arcades connecting the structure to wing buildings. The version at Knott's has a clock tower, but does not have the arches connecting to any buildings on its sides. Also, in the book The Liberty Bell, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, by Charles S. Kaiser from 1901, there is a section that describes the materials that were used in the structure. It's built of red clay bricks from Philadelphia, blue and white marble from quarries near the Schuylkill River, and it has coins made of faded green serpentine stone from Westchester. Coins are stone ornamentation found on the corners of some buildings. They can be found on the front corners of the real building at Independence Hall, but were left off of the Knott's version. It goes on to describe the building as 107 feet again in length and 45 feet in width. The first floor is divided into two rooms, each 40 feet square with ceiling 20 feet high. These rooms are divided by a hallway 20 feet wide, extending from the north to the south through the building to a broad stairway which gives access to the second floor. It goes on to explain that the room on the east side first floor is the Declaration Chamber, and on the west side is the Supreme Court room of the province. The building built at Knott's is also in that same alignment with the compass, so north, south, east, and west sections of the real building match the same directions of the Knott's building. Continuing on, in January 1750, the Assembly authorized the addition of a tower with a staircase and belfry. In case you're like me and aren't sure what a belfry is, well, it's just a spot in a tower where a bell can be installed. The original version of this tower steeple on top of the building was completed in 1753. A bell from the State House had been commissioned in 1751, or 1752, again, sources vary, from Thomas Lester and Thomas Pack from London, but their bell cracked soon after it arrived. It was twice recast in 1753 by local metalworkers John Pass and John Stowe, and it was hung in the State House sometime between April 17th and June 7th, 1753. Quick spoiler, that bell is now known as the Liberty Bell. The real bell is located in a museum across from Independence Hall today, but a replica can also be found inside Independence Hall at Knott's. I'll be covering the bell in a little more detail later in the show. Also, it's worth pointing out that the original tower had a clock that rang a separate, not the Liberty, bell every hour. But clock faces were on the east and west sides of the building, not on the tower itself. Inside the building, there would eventually be ornate woodwork, but it wasn't started until the tower addition was completed. It was carved by Samuel Harding and Brian Wilkinson, prominent carvers from Philadelphia that had done other work for Andrew Hamilton's son, James. I guess I should point out at this point, Andrew Hamilton had passed away in 1741. 12 years before that, interior woodwork began to be added to the State House, which took Harding and Wilkinson between 1753 and 1757 to complete. An interesting thing I learned while doing all of this research was that the State House bell was rung to announce when members of the royal family ascended to the throne, which means back when King George III took his place as the King of England in 1760, this future Liberty Bell rang in his honor. Not important to the story perhaps, but it was news to me, so I felt I should share. Continuing on, by 1773, the original steeple had been rotting and decaying, and the bell had stopped being rung in fear of the tower collapsing. On June 15, 1775, George Washington accepted his appointment by Congress as General of the Continental Army in this building. And then, now I don't think I'm breaking any news here, but this is the reason why the old Pennsylvania State House is now known as Independence Hall. It was this building on July 4th, 1776, that the Second Continental Congress signed, and I quote, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, which is more commonly known as the Declaration of Independence. The State House bell was possibly rung along with other bells in Philadelphia on July 8th when the Declaration was first read to the public. It was still in that decaying tower, though, so some historians argue that it's likely that they left it alone that day. In 1778, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union between the states were adopted and signed. In 1781, those Articles of Confederation went into effect, while also the 24 regime standards, or flags, that were taken at the surrender of Yorktown were presented to Congress and the ambassador of France. Also, this was the year the steeple was finally removed and covered with a hipped roof, with the future Liberty Bell lowered into that shorter piece of the tower. Following the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the U.S. Constitution was signed. Really, the signing of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in this building are what cemented it in history as the birthplace of America and an icon for independence. Also in 1787, wooden sheds to the left and right of the State House were removed to make way for the City Hall and County Courthouse. From 1790 to 1800, Philadelphia was the temporary federal capital. On May 14th, 1800, the nation's capital was moved to Washington, D.C., and in 1812, Pennsylvania designated Harrisburg as its capital, making it where Philadelphia was no longer a federal or state capital. At this point, the city and county of Philadelphia demolished the open arcade archways and wing buildings and replaced them with modern office buildings, at least modern for the time. They were used for municipal administration and storing records. Due to a lack of public funds, it was also around this time that the State House was almost torn down. But the city bought the buildings and square from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1818 for $70,000 to prevent that from happening. Marquis de Lafayette, America's favorite fighting Frenchman from Hamilton. If you don't know, he helped during the Revolutionary War by getting France to support the American cause, among other stuff, I'm sure. Well, he came back to the US from France for a very public tour in 1824, and it was because of this visit that moves were made to restore the State House back to its former glory. It was actually during his visit that the old assembly room was first referred to as the, quote, Hall of Independence. William Strickland, a famous American architect, you can check out his Wikipedia page if you don't believe us, designed a new steeple tower to replace the one that had rotted away and was removed 43 years earlier. It was constructed in 1828 and wasn't an exact replica, but had a similar feel to the original, except with more ornamentation. And this time it included clock faces. A new bell was cast by John Wilbank, and a clock was constructed by Isaiah Lukens. Within 2 years of adding the steeple back to the building, interest grew in restoring the assembly room, which at that point people were calling the Hall of Independence. No one was certain what the room had looked like in colonial times, so they based the remodel on the mayor's courtroom, which was the former Supreme Courtroom located across the hall from it. Now, I had said I would go into more detail about the Liberty Bell, and the reason why I saved it for this point in the timeline is because the bell itself wasn't really considered significant until around 1839. I mentioned earlier that the bell had been recast twice by local metal workers after the original version from London had cracked when they tried to set it up. The last names of those two metal workers, Pass and Stowe, are found on both the original and the replica versions of the bell. Also on both bells are the words, by order of the Assembly of the Province of Pennsylvania for the State House of Philad. It then has an A over a period, as well as a verse from Leviticus 25:10, proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, Lev XXV, then with a V with a squiggle through it, maybe it means verse, and then an X. Beneath that, they both read Philad, again with an A over a period, which I believe is just an abbreviation for Philadelphia. I'm sure it was common at the time. And below that, though, are the Roman numerals for 1753, the year that it was cast. And those Roman numerals are MDCCLIII. The bell that eventually became the Liberty Bell was made using the same metal used from the original bell from England that had cracked, except around 3,000 more ounces of copper were added to make it less brittle. In the end, the bell was made up of 70% copper, 25% tin, and the remaining 5% were split between lead, gold, arsenic, silver, and zinc. The version found at Knott's claims to have the same ratio of these metals, with Bud Hurlbut quoted saying he was allowed to take a filing from the inside of the bell to determine the exact metal composition. The bells are 12 feet in circumference at their widest and 7 foot 6 inches around the crown, and are 3 feet tall from the top to the bottom. And the real bell weighs about 2,080 pounds, while it's often said that the Knott's version weighs 2,075, so close enough. As for the design of the bells, they are based on one that had been cast by order of King Edward III sometime before 1377. It was dedicated to the memory of Edward the Confessor, and was inscribed in Latin saying it was made, quote, so that by the grace of St. Edward the hours may be marked, end quote. It hung in the tower of the Palace of Westminster, where Big Ben Tower is today, but was eventually moved to St. Paul's Cathedral, where it still rings now. It is known as Great Tom, and though the Liberty Bell looks similar, Great Tom is a much larger bell, at over 9,000 pounds compared to the roughly 2,000 pounds for the Liberty Bell. Going back to Knott's, I do want to point out that if you put photos of both Liberty Bells side by side, it doesn't take a trained eye to figure out which one dates back to the 1750s and which one was created in the 1960s. But if this was an episode of Is It Cake or Nailed It, I would be very impressed by how close the Knott's version matches the original. From the horizontal lines being in the correct spots and the typefaces being a very close match, I mean, even the wooden yoke that holds it up was very clearly meticulously analyzed. The metal coloring isn't a perfect match, and the crack isn't identical, but again, it's really close. In the original Knott's guidebook for Independence Hall, there is a section dedicated to their version of the Liberty Bell. It was designed by Bud Hurlbut and his father, Ray. They used the size, weight, and metallic composition that were on record, but everything else they had to figure out on their own. Adding a custom crack to a newly forged bell took them a while to figure out. They built a fracture into the mold's bell pattern, but trying to get it to actually crack wasn't working. They eventually resorted to freezing the bell in dry ice and then taking a Hilliard welding torch to it, and that did the trick. The yoke, which again looks very similar, if lighter in color and younger looking compared with the original, came from a long search for a 125-year-old slippery elm tree, which they somehow found in the Sinisippi Forest in Illinois, which, by the way, was later renamed to Loudon Miller State Forest back in 1992. A quick note though, no one really knows whether or not the yoke on display with the actual bell was its original yoke when it was in the belfry. They also created a solid cherrywood pedestal that matched very closely with what was being used at the time in Philadelphia. Today, the yoke for the Liberty Bell rests on metal poles, but back when they were building this version in the mid 60s, the Liberty Bell was still inside of Independence Hall instead of across the way in its own museum, with a large floor to ceiling window separating it and Independence Hall visible across the way behind it. We will post photos on our blog showing how it looked around 1960, and it's pretty close to how it is displayed at the Berry Farm. From that cherrywood pedestal to the details of the room it was located in, it really is a reminder that the Knott's version is a snapshot of what Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell looked like back in 1966. Now to get back to history of the real bell. It first rang on August 27th, 1753 to summon the members of the Assembly to the State House. May 17th, 1755, the bell rang when the Assembly declared they would not make laws by direction, which was one of the first steps toward colonial independence and defiance of British rule. On October 31st, 1765, the bell rang all day long in protest after the Stamp Act was put in effect. And yeah, it may or may not have rung on July 8th, 1776, and again on July 4th, 1777. The bell was taken down and moved to Allentown, Pennsylvania from September 18th, 1777 to June 27th, 1778, while the State House served as the headquarters for the British Army after American losses at the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of the Clouds. The British Army evacuated Philadelphia on June 18th, 1778, after France entered the war on the side of the Americans. In 1781, the State House steeple was taken down and the bell was lowered into the brick tower. Almost 50 years later, in 1828, the wooden steeple was rebuilt and a new bell was acquired. Like I had said earlier, it was cast by John Wilbank. But the old bell likely stayed where it was, mostly forgotten. But then in 1839, the first use of the term Liberty Bell occurred with a booklet entitled The Liberty Bell, which used the biblical verse on the bell to promote the anti slavery movement. Again, that's proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. The booklet was an annual abolitionist gift book by Maria Weston Chapman to be sold or gifted to members of the National Anti Slavery Bazaar, which was organized by the Boston Female Anti Slavery Society. It was published almost every year between 1839 and 1858. From that point forward, though, the bell was known as the Liberty Bell, no longer the old State House bell, the bell of the Revolution, nor the old Independence, as some were calling it. But at that point, it was really an icon for anti slavery, not specifically patriotism. Also, at some point, the bell cracked. Nobody really knows why or how or when. All we do know is that in 1846, there was an attempt to restore the bell's tone by drilling the crack to try to separate the fracture. That didn't work. The last time the bell rang normally was on Washington's birthday in 1846. But that didn't stop the bell from having an impact, with legends and myths starting to form, beginning with a fictional story about a bell ringer on July 4th, 1776, that was published in the Philadelphia Saturday Courier in 1847, which was quickly followed by more stories from other writers. Continuing down the timeline, in 1852, less than a decade before the Civil War, councils resolved to celebrate July 4th annually, quote, in the said State House known as Independence Hall. And this was the first time the term was used for the entire building, not just the assembly room. At this time, also, the Liberty Bell was taken down from the tower where nobody could see it to the east room of the assembly room. In 1870, an act of the General Assembly approved the demolition of the other buildings on the State House Square, but it wasn't carried out. In 1872, a committee was named by the mayor for the restoration of Independence Hall. Furniture that was believed to have been in the assembly room in 1776 was gathered from the state capitol in Harrisburg and from private sources. Pillars thought to have supported the ceiling were added back to the interior, and the president's dais was rebuilt. On the outside of the building, red paint was removed. On the interior, carved ornamentation that had been hidden behind layers of paint for years was discovered. During the Centennial Restoration Project in 1876, a large bell and a new clock were given to the city by Henry Siebert for the steeple. These are still being used today. Also in 1876, the Liberty Bell was hung from the ceiling near the southern door of the building, near the staircase. It wasn't until between 1896 and 1898 that a general program for restoring Independence Square resulted in those modern office buildings being torn down and the original arcade archways and wing buildings being put back in place. And that is how it looked in the 1960s when Walter Knott was building his version, and it has been mostly unchanged through today, though the Liberty Bell was moved out of Independence Hall in 1976. Before we wrap up about Independence Hall, though, we want to mention that the official statement is that the Knott's version is an exact brick by brick replica of the original in Philadelphia, and that it is the only exact replica in the nation. Now, we haven't counted every brick, but just from a quick analysis from photos we've taken at both locations, there are some notable differences. Also, there is a replica of Independence Hall at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, that was built in 1929, and they also claim their building is an exact replica. So you can take that for what it is. As for those differences, we had mentioned the lack of coins earlier, those ornamental cornerstones that are on the real building, and that the arched arcades and the side buildings are missing completely, but there are also some other differences that prevent it from truly being an exact replica. For example, the clock faces on the tower at Knott's appear to be painted either black or a slight blue with black, with the real versions appearing aquamarine during the day and white at night because they are translucent, with the tower inside being painted in aquamarine color. Also, beneath the clock faces are laurel branches, which at Knott's are painted gold, but the real versions are painted white. Going around to the front of the Knott's building, it has a staircase leading to a door upstairs, while the real version has neither stairs nor a door on the second floor. There is a door on the west wall at the real building, but it isn't on the Knott's version. More subtle details include the lack of a basement in the Knott's version, where they didn't even try to fake it with some windows along the base of the building to make it look like what you would find with the basement windows at the original. Also, the real version has large stone rectangles under each of the upstairs windows on the front of the building, as well as stone lines that run above and below the windows, and stone ornamentation keystones above each window. There are also stairs leading up to the door in the center of the front of the building, and ornate rainspouts and a few plaques randomly placed, all of which are not present at Knott's. Inside the building, you can see how the Knott's version was clearly inspired by the original, but the almost 4 years of woodwork of Harding and Wilkinson wasn't exactly matched at Knott's. There are intricately carved details in the real version that are just flat wooded knots, from the detail work around the fireplaces to carvings and keystones that are just missing. Also, the Declaration Room in Philadelphia has a nice glass chandelier that is absent. But the style of furniture they use does look like a close match, including the use of greenish tablecloths. Both versions have an example of Washington's sun chair, which Benjamin Franklin is quoted as explaining that he wasn't sure if it was setting or rising. After the signing of the Declaration of Independence, now he knows it is rising. But there are even more nitpicky details that we noticed are different, like the rectangular window on the side of the tower facing the square. The Knott's version is a 4 by 5 paned window, while the real version is 5 by 6 and kind of comes out a little dimensionally. And it also has a carved head as a keystone above the window, while Knott's just has a flat window lintel. Also, I don't get why they planted so many Italian cypress trees around the building at Knott's. I cannot find any archival photos to show that the real version ever had any, and it definitely doesn't today. Also, if you visit these days, there is an ornate clock outside on the west side of the Independence Hall building, which isn't at Knott's, but in their defense, that clock was restored from an original design by Thomas Stretch, which was missing in 1966, having been put back in place in 1973. Oh, yeah, and I guess the building is close enough to the real building because it was used in the Disney film National Treasure starring Nicolas Cage. There's a scene where they unroll the Declaration of Independence in the Declaration Room, and you can tell it's Knott's because the wall behind them is missing the details around the fireplaces. Also, the top of the banister that separates guests from the furniture in the room has a wood grain in Philadelphia, but it is painted at Knott's. Okay, so that covers everything we know about Independence Hall. But I also want to point out that at Knott's, there's a nearby statue that has also been a part of this area since 1970 and is currently in a corner over near Beach Boulevard. This is a bronze looking statue of a colonial era man holding a musket, stepping away from a plow. In Philadelphia, there are statues of men on pedestals in front of and in back of the building, with George Washington located at the front and Commodore John Barry found in the square in the back. Both of those statues were added in the early 1900s, but neither of them are at Knott's. Instead, we have this piece that is inspired by the Minuteman statue by Daniel Chester French from 1874, with the version at Knott's having been sculpted by Claude Bell, the same guy who created several sculptures of people found on benches inside the park, as well as the huge dinosaurs off the 10 freeway in Cabazon. But yeah, as for the Minuteman statues, at the base of both this statue and the original, it reads, by the rude bridge, the arch, the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. This is the opening stanza of the poem Concord Hymn by Ralph Waldo Emerson. It was written for the dedication of the Battle Monument in Concord, Massachusetts, and was sung at the ceremony for that dedication on July 4th, 1837. The reason why a line from this poem is written on these pedestals is because back in 1875, the original statue was added to what would later be known as Minuteman National Park, which is also where the battle monument is located. If you want to learn more about this battle, which started military engagement of the Revolutionary War, look up the battles of Lexington and Concord. If you visit the historic park today, the original battle monument is on one side of a replica of the Old North Bridge, and this statue is on the other. So, yeah, that's what that statue is, a monument to an average person who was willing to stand up to tyranny, found at a location where the Revolutionary War began. I'm also pretty sure Walter Knott chose it instead of Washington or Barry because it depicts a farmer standing up for his country, which Walter could likely relate to. Oh, and just a fun fact. Back in 2000, the artwork on the state quarter for Massachusetts included this Minuteman statue. And while we're talking about art on money, Independence Hall has been on the back of $100 bills since 1928, with art originally depicting the back of the building. But since 2013, it has an engraving of the front instead, with the statue of George Washington depicted. If you want to see art of the inside of the building, you'll just need to find a $2 bill from 1966 through today. And well, that wraps up this episode of the Where in the Park podcast. If you had a good time and or learned something new today, please give us a like, subscribe, follow, 5-star review, or whatever the platform you're listening to us on lets you do to share our show with others. And until next time, we'll see you somewhere in the park.
Thanks for exploring with us today. If you're ready to take your park experience to the next level, check out our Where in the Park games. They're self-paced seek-and-find adventures designed to help you explore the parks in a whole new way, whether you're visiting for a birthday, a family gathering, a date night, or even a solo trip. You won't find our images on rides, in lines, or inside shops or restaurants. They're just out in the open as you wander around the park. Get ready to experience a deeper appreciation for your favorite theme parks. Head over to whereinthepark.com and use code PODCAST10 to take 10% off your next adventure. Until next time, we'll see you somewhere in the park.